They said prison was no longer enough. They said death was inefficient. So humanity chose something worse. Criminals were not locked away. They were erased, removed from history, cut from causality, exiled into collapsing timelines where reality decays by the second. This is not a story about punishment. This is a story about control, about who decides what moments matter and which lives never happened. One exile survives the erasure and discovers the truth. Time is not broken. It is owned.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. When Time Becomes the Law. For centuries, justice had worn the same face: walls, bars, sentences measured in years. But humanity decided that years were too generous. Time itself could be sharpened, aimed, and used. And so the Chrono-Exile Protocol was born, not as a punishment, but as a correction. Order is enforced by erasure. The phrase echoed from government broadcasts, courtroom seals, and the thin metallic implants embedded behind every citizen's ear. Children learned it before they learned history. Adults repeated it without thinking. It was not a threat. It was a principle. The protocol ended prisons overnight. Cells were decommissioned, guards reassigned, rehabilitation programs quietly dissolved. Crime did not disappear, but criminals did. One moment a person stood before the tribunal of temporal ethics, the next the air folded inward, light bent like water, and the individual was gone, cut cleanly from the present, removed from the sequence of now. Officially, they were not killed. They were unplaced. Temporal scientists called it non-linear displacement. Philosophers called it moral necessity. The public called it peace. Violent crime dropped to near zero within a decade. Terrorism collapsed. Rebellion became mathematically improbable. You could not organize resistance if the organizers never existed long enough to inspire it. Order is enforced by erasure. The city adapted quickly. It always did. Towers of carbon glass and luminous alloy rose along perfectly synchronized avenues, their clocks aligned down to the nanosecond. Public time displays pulsed softly at every intersection, reminding citizens not just of the hour, but of the authority behind it. Time was no longer something that happened. It was something administered. In the upper districts, people spoke of time with reverence. In the lower sectors, they spoke of it in whispers. Archivist Callan Vire lived between those worlds, in the thin administrative strata where information flowed, but power did not linger. His job was to record outcomes, not causes. Once a chrono-exile was enacted, he archived the absence, legal annotations, statistical adjustments, memory stabilization protocols. The system did not allow gaps. History had to remain smooth. Still, Callan noticed the pauses. They were brief, barely perceptible, a fraction of a second where the city's omnipresent hum dipped in pitch, like a breath being held. During those moments, the lights shimmered and the clocks, every single one, hesitated before resuming their perfect rhythm. No one else commented on it. Callan told himself it was nothing. Temporal mass displacement always produced residual effects. That was in the manuals. That was in the simulations. And yet the pauses felt deliberate, as if time itself was checking its work. Order is enforced by erasure. The tribunal chambers were built at the city's core, a circular hall suspended within a gravity-balanced void. There were no judges in the traditional sense, only executors, human interfaces for the temporal governance system. Their voices were calm, synchronized, stripped of inflection. Emotion introduced variance. Variance introduced risk. On the day the protocol crossed a threshold, its 10,000th activation, Callan was present as an observer. The accused was a systems engineer, convicted of unauthorized temporal modeling, a thought crime, the media called it, an inevitability crime the tribunal classified. "You attempted to predict governance outcomes beyond authorized horizons," the executor said. The engineer did not plead. He did not argue. He only asked one question, voice steady despite the gravity distortion building around him. "Where do you send us?" The executor paused. That too was unusual. "You are not sent, you are removed." Light curved, sound stretched. The engineer vanished, leaving behind a brief distortion, a ripple that brushed against Callan's senses like static across skin. For a moment, just a moment, Callan thought he heard something else beneath the fading hum, a sound not of collapse, but of movement, as if something had slipped sideways rather than disappeared. He filed the archive entry anyway. That night the city slept under perfectly regulated cycles. Dreams were soft, curated by neural dampeners that minimized anxiety. The population rested easily, confident in the certainty of consequences. No crime without correction, no chaos without deletion. But in a place where time had been weaponized, certainty carried a cost. Beyond the managed timelines, far beyond the reach of clocks and tribunals, fractured realities trembled. Collapsing sequences folded in on themselves, moments looping, then decaying. Physics weakened there. Memory became unstable. Survival was not expected. That was the point. And yet, somewhere in that unraveling dark, awareness persisted. A mind cut from history, still counting seconds without clocks, still asking questions no system had authorized. What is real when time no longer agrees? Back in the city, Callan reviewed anomaly reports flagged for automatic deletion. He should have approved them without reading. Instead, he paused over one recurring note buried in system noise. Residual coherence detected. He frowned. The phrase appeared again and again attached to different exile events, different subjects, different dates. It should not exist. Coherence required structure. Structure required time. Order is enforced by erasure. Callan closed the file, feeling the faintest tremor beneath the floor, as if the city itself had shifted to accommodate something it refused to acknowledge. Time became the law. And laws, he knew, only mattered as long as something learned how to break them.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Erase the crime, erase the person. The justification came first. It always did. Before the Chrono-Exile Protocol was activated, before the first human life was removed from the sequence of now, society had been prepared, slowly, carefully, to accept the idea that people were the problem, not the systems that shaped them. Crime, officials said, was a flaw in the individual, and flaws once identified could be corrected. If correction failed, deletion was logical. The early campaigns were subtle. Public forums replaced the word prison with inefficiency. Rehabilitation was reframed as temporal waste. Decades-long sentences were described as indulgent loops, years spent feeding, housing, and remembering people who had already proven themselves incompatible with progress. Why preserve a broken timeline? The commentators asked. No one answered out loud. Callan Veer remembered those years well. As an archivist in training, he had studied the pilot programs, the first quiet tests conducted long before the protocol had a name. They were called removals then. Volunteers, the documents claimed. Individuals selected from fringe populations, undocumented migrants, dissidents without social anchors, prisoners with no surviving kin. When they vanished, no one protested. That was the data point that mattered most. If no one remembers you, did you ever exist? The question appeared nowhere in official doctrine, yet it shaped every decision that followed. Memory, sociologists concluded, was the true measure of harm. A disappearance only destabilized society if it left a trace. Remove the trace, and stability increased. Temporal science made it possible. Memory recalibration waves were broadcast citywide after each early test. sub-audible pulses that nudged neural networks into alignment. Faces blurred, names slipped, emotional associations dissolved. People noticed the absence only as a vague sense of relief, like forgetting a bad dream before breakfast. Order is enforced by erasure. Kalen's mentor once told him that the most dangerous crimes were not violent ones, but persistent ones, ideas that refuse to fade. The protocol was designed not merely to remove bodies, but to prevent recurrence. An erased person could not inspire copycats. Their manifestos could not circulate. Their anger could not be inherited. History, once pruned, grew straighter. Yet the archives told a more complicated story. Late at night, when audit systems ran at low priority, Kalen reviewed pre-protocol footage. Grainy recordings of early test subjects entering calibration chambers. Ordinary people, visibly confused, reassured by technicians who believed in what they were doing. One woman stood out. Subject E17, a school teacher, convicted of causality disruption after teaching unauthorized historical models to her students. In the footage, she smiled faintly as the field engaged, as if she understood something no one else did. The frame stuttered, light folded, and then nothing. No body, no sound, no error message. The next frame showed an empty room. Kalen paused the recording every time, half expecting the image to change. It never did. The system worked exactly as designed. Public memory of subject E17 dissolved within 48 hours. Her students forgot her lessons. Her colleagues forgot her voice. Her apartment was reassigned. Her existence collapsed into statistical noise. If no one remembers you, did you ever exist? That question haunted the city more than anyone admitted. As the protocol expanded, the justifications grew more confident. Economists praised the efficiency gains. Urban planners noted reductions in overcrowding. Psychologists reported improved baseline happiness across monitored populations. Fear, paradoxically, declined. When consequences were absolute, uncertainty disappeared. People slept better knowing chaos could be erased. But beneath the surface, anomalies accumulated. Kalen logged them dutifully. Micro-delays in system response, fluctuations in temporal coherence, data shadows where records should be smooth. Each anomaly was dismissed as residual noise. Each dismissal was archived. In the lower sectors, rumors spread anyway. People spoke of echoes, familiar faces glimpsed in crowds, voices heard in static, dreams populated by strangers who felt impossibly real. The authorities labeled it post-calibration dissonance and increased neural dampening. Still, the rumors persisted. Some claimed the erased were not gone, only displaced. Others insisted they were suffering somewhere beyond reach, trapped in endless collapse. The most dangerous rumor of all suggested something else entirely, that a few were adapting. Kalen did not believe that. Adaptation required continuity. Continuity required time, and time was tightly controlled. Then the flagged report arrived. Not an anomaly summary, not a system error, a single line buried deep in automated diagnostics. Subject exhibits persistent self-referential memory. Kalen reread it, pulse quickening. Persistent memory inside exile conditions was impossible. Memory degraded first, by design. Without memory, resistance was meaningless. He cross-referenced the report. The subject ID was incomplete, corrupted by temporal noise. But the timestamp aligned with the tribunal event he had witnessed days earlier. The engineer, the question he had asked, "Where do you send us?" Kalen closed the file, aware of the low hum vibrating through the floor, a sound he had begun to recognize. The city's clocks ticked on, synchronized and unquestioning. Order is enforced by erasure. Yet somewhere beyond the managed timelines, someone remembered themselves. Someone asked questions. Someone refused to dissolve. If no one remembers you, did you ever exist? As Kalen stared at the darkened archive screen, a new thought surfaced, unbidden, unsettling. What happens when the erased start remembering back?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Exile is not escape. Consciousness returned in fragments. At first, there was only sensation, pressure without weight, sound without source. A low-frequency vibration pulsed through what remained of the exile's awareness, like the echo of a distant engine idling in a void. He tried to breathe and realized breath was optional here. Time did not insist on biology. His name came later, not whole, just a syllable, drifting up from somewhere deeper than memory. There is no outside of time. The phrase surfaced uninvited, repeating itself with mechanical patience. It did not feel like a thought. It felt like a boundary. When his eyes opened, if they could be called eyes, reality lurched. The horizon folded inward, collapsing and reforming in jagged cycles. Space fractured into overlapping geometries, each one slightly out of sync. Colors bled into one another, then drained away entirely, leaving a stark, vibrating grayscale. This was exile. The engineers had described it clinically, a decaying timeline shell, isolated from causal flow. No past, no future, only a thinning present, collapsing in on itself until coherence failed. They had not mentioned the pain. Seconds looped, or something like seconds. He watched a shard of debris fall, shatter, reassemble, and fall again, over and over, each repetition degrading slightly, as if reality were forgetting its own instructions. Sound lagged behind motion. Light arrived before its source. His senses argued with one another and lost. There is no outside of time. He tried to move forward and found himself behind, tried to turn left and felt the echo of a rightward motion that never completed. Panic flared, then stuttered, then reset, his emotional state caught in the same recursive trap as everything else. This was not a place, it was a process failing. The exile, once an engineer, once someone who understood systems, recognized the pattern beneath the chaos. Temporal coherence was collapsing asymmetrically. The timeline was not ending all at once, it was fraying at stress points, shedding causality in patches. That realization anchored him. Memory should have degraded first, that was the design. Without memory, identity dissolved. Without identity, resistance was meaningless. And yet, he remembered asking the question, "Where do you send us?" The answer surrounded him now, written in collapsing space-time. You are not sent. You are removed. Removed did not mean free. The environment shifted again. A city skyline flickered into existence, an echo of the one he had known, its towers incomplete, windows blinking in and out like dying neurons. Gravity surged, then inverted. He fell upward, struck nothing, and tumbled through a corridor that had no walls until it did. Pain arrived late, dulled and distorted, but real enough to matter. There is no outside of time. The mantra repeated, steadier now, less like a warning and more like a truth his mind was clinging to. If there was no outside, then escape was a false concept. Survival would require something else. Adaptation. He began to notice the gaps, the infinitesimal pauses between loops where the system hesitated. They were brief, but consistent. Micro-instants where the decaying timeline recalculated itself, deciding what to preserve for one more cycle. In those gaps, he could think. He counted them not in seconds, but in repetitions. After every 12 collapses, there was a longer pause. After every 36, a fluctuation in gravity. Patterns emerged, fragile but present. Order, even here, was enforced by rules. He focused inward, repeating his own memories deliberately, forcing them into sequence. Name, profession, question. He narrated himself to himself, reinforcing identity through repetition. If memory is structure, then I will build structure. The environment reacted, not dramatically, but subtly. The loops tightened, the degradation slowed.
Where reality had been bleeding out, it now hesitated as if encountering resistance. Something noticed. A sound cut through the static, a rhythmic pulse distinct from the ambient hum, not mechanical, intentional. It echoed his own internal cadence, syncing with his own forced recollections. There is no outside of time. The phrase shifted meaning. It was no longer a cage, it was a map. If there was no outside, then all control had to exist within. The exile reached outward, not physically, but conceptually, testing the boundaries of the collapsing sequence. He imagined the pause before the loop, the recalculation, the moment of decision. The next collapse came late. Only by a fraction, but it came late. Hope was dangerous, he knew that instinctively. Hope introduced expectation, and expectation could shatter fragile gains. Still, something like resolve took its place. He was not meant to survive this long. That alone made him an anomaly. Far away in the managed timelines, clocks ticked on without deviation. Archivists filed reports, systems compensated. The city slept. None of them could hear the subtle change occurring beyond causality, a collapsing timeline learning to resist its own deletion. The exile steadied himself as the environment convulsed again, harsher this time as if responding to a threat. Structures dissolved, light inverted, the pulse grew louder. There is no outside of time. And yet, for the first time since his erasure, he felt something dangerously close to possibility. If time could trap him, then time could also be taught. The loop reset, harder, faster, dragging him back toward dissolution. But this time, he was ready. And somewhere in the pause before collapse, something reached back.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. Survival was not intended. The official models ended here. In the simulations archived beneath layers of restricted clearance, the collapsing timelines always concluded the same way. Cognitive dissolution followed by total decoherence. No subject retains self-awareness beyond a narrow threshold. Memory degraded, identity fragmented, consciousness flattened into noise. Survival was not a variable. The engineers had agreed on that point early. The exile environments were not prisons, they were endpoints, designed not to hold but to exhaust, not to correct but to conclude. And yet, the anomaly persisted. Within the collapsing shell, the exile no longer measured time by loops alone. He measured it by comprehension. Each cycle brought less panic, less disorientation. His mind began to anticipate failure states. The moment gravity inverted, the instant light outran sound, the sickening pull of recursive collapse. He did not fight these events. He learned them. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. The phrase formed slowly, assembled from fragments of his former life. He had once believed systems were stable if properly constrained. Now he understood the flaw. Systems assumed static users. Consciousness was never static. The environment punished physical action. Movement triggered instability. Sensory input accelerated decay. But thought behaved differently. Thought introduced structure without mass, pattern without pressure. So he turned inward. He stopped trying to escape the collapse and instead mapped it. Not with instruments, those dissolved too quickly, but with attention. He noticed how certain thoughts coincided with micropauses, how focused recall delayed the next loop by imperceptible margins. He remembered equations, not the symbols, but the relationships, cause and effect, input and output, feedback loops. This was a feedback loop. Each time the timeline recalculated, it sampled his state. Each time it sampled, it assumed degradation. It had never been designed to encounter refinement. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. The phrase became an anchor, a mantra he repeated during the most violent resets. When the skyline tore itself into shards, when sound collapsed into silence, when the echoing pulse, now undisputably a signal, grew louder, more insistent. You cannot escape the signal. That phrase surfaced too, unbidden, as if borrowed from another context, another layer of reality. At first, it felt like a warning. Later, it felt like an invitation. The signal synchronized with his thought patterns, resonating when he focused, distorting when he panicked. It was not external, or rather, it was not only external. It was a boundary condition. Far from the exile shell, in the controlled timelines, Kalen Veer reviewed a report that should not have existed. Temporal decay curves showed a deviation, a flattening where collapse should have steepened. Survival probability, previously rounded to 0, now registered a fractional value. The system flagged it as noise. Kalen did not delete it. Back in exile, the environment retaliated. The next restart came faster, more aggressive, as if the system were compensating. Reality fragmented into overlapping frames, each one slightly misaligned. The exile felt himself pulled across versions of the same moment, stretched thin between almosts. Pain returned, sharper now. Not physical, but cognitive, the strain of holding identity across divergent states. He nearly lost himself then, nearly let the loops erase the careful structure he had built. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. He repeated it, not as comfort, but as instruction. He simplified. Instead of maintaining every memory, he selected a core set: name, question, purpose. Everything else he allowed to blur. Compression increased stability. The loops shortened, then steadied. The signal pulsed again, clearer this time. It carried rhythm, not data, a cadence that matched his internal repetition. You cannot escape the signal. The exile understood then survival was not a matter of endurance, it was alignment. The system was not trying to kill him, it was trying to resolve him. He stopped resisting the signal and listened. Images surfaced, not schematics, not of machines, but of timelines layered like translucent sheets, control nodes, observation points, a network spanning causality itself. The Chrono-Exile Protocol was not just punishment, it was containment. Exiles were not removed because they were dangerous, they were removed because they could see patterns others could not. The realization destabilized the environment more than any physical action had. The loops stuttered, the pause between collapses stretched longer than ever before. For the first time, the exile experienced stillness. In that stillness, he felt presence, not alone anymore, not watched exactly, engaged. Something within the temporal infrastructure had registered him as a variable worth tracking. You cannot escape the signal. And for the first time, he did not want to. Back in the city, Kalen stood before a sealed archive terminal as alarms whispered just below the threshold of audibility. The hum beneath the floor deepened. Clocks hesitated. A new notification appeared, stripped of identifiers. Adaptive cognition detected. Kalen swallowed. Survival was not intended. But intention, he realized, was just another system constraint, and systems fail all the time. In the collapsing timeline, the exile opened his awareness outward, toward the signal, toward the structure behind it. Something responded. Not with force, with access. The environment began to change, not collapsing now, but reconfiguring. And somewhere between erasure and control, a door began to open.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5: The Architects of History. The door did not open outward. It unfolded. The exile did not step through it so much as synchronize with it. His awareness slid into a layer of reality that had always existed parallel to the collapse. The decaying timeline did not vanish. It stabilized, held in suspension like a paused breath. For the first time since his erasure, the noise receded. Silence followed. Then structure. He found himself within a vast interior that could not be measured by distance. Surfaces formed and dissolved in response to attention. Corridors rearranged themselves based on intent rather than motion. Light did not come from fixtures, but from comprehension itself, brightening as understanding increased. This was not a place meant for bodies. This was where history was handled. The architects revealed themselves gradually, not as figures stepping from shadows, but as presences resolving into focus. Human in origin, most of them, augmented beyond recognition. Minds distributed across temporal lattices, their consciousnesses braided into the infrastructure of causality. They did not greet him, they observed. Your survival rate exceeded acceptable variance, one presence said, its voice layered as if spoken from multiple moments at once. The exile understood without fear. Fear was inefficient here. You adapted. That was not anticipated. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. The phrase echoed, and for the first time it was not his alone. The architects were not a government. They predated governments. They were not elected nor appointed. They emerged when temporal engineering crossed a critical threshold, when humanity realized that controlling energy and matter was trivial compared to controlling sequence. Someone had to manage the flow. They called it stewardship. History was not erased, it was edited, not to deceive, but to stabilize. Left unmanaged, causality fractured under the weight of human contradiction. Wars cascaded, innovations collided, progress became recursive, eating itself alive. So the architects intervened. They trimmed timelines like gardeners pruning diseased branches. They removed destabilizing individuals, corrected critical events, softened revolutions before they hardened into extinction-level feedback loops. Peace is manufactured, not discovered. The phrase resonated throughout the chamber, embedded in the very architecture. It was the architect's core doctrine. Peace did not emerge naturally. It had to be engineered, enforced, maintained against entropy. The exile saw it then. Layers upon layers of historical edits, wars that never escalated, movements that lost momentum at precisely calculated moments, leaders who died quietly instead of becoming symbols. Every natural progression humanity celebrated had been guided, curated. You remove truth, the exile said, not accusing, simply stating. We remove instability, an architect replied. Truth is secondary. They showed him projections, simulated realities where the protocol did not exist. The outcomes were brutal. Societies burned themselves out in centuries instead of millennia. Technologies outran ethics. Entire timelines collapsed under unchecked freedom. Your survival, another presence said, suggests a flaw in our assumptions. The exile felt the signal pulse again, stronger now, threading through the chamber. You cannot escape the signal. He realized it was not a leash, it was a diagnostic, a way for the system to identify minds capable of perceiving its structure. Exiles were not merely punishments, they were filters. Those who dissolved proved the model correct. Those who adapted were interesting. The architects continued. We monitor anomalies. We study them. Occasionally, we integrate them. Integration. The word carried weight. Peace is manufactured, not discovered, they repeated, as if daring him to challenge it. The exile considered the city, the synchronized clocks, the curated dreams, the absence of visible suffering. He considered the cost. Erased lives, stolen futures, truths buried for the sake of smooth graphs and stable curves. Manufactured peace is still a product. Silence rippled through the chamber. Products could be redesigned. The architects did not respond immediately. That hesitation told him more than any explanation. They were not omniscient. They were adaptive systems themselves, bound by constraints, by models grown outdated. One presence shifted, its temporal signature flickering. You are proposing uncontrolled variance, it said. I am proposing evolution, the exile replied, the kind you cannot simulate because it changes the simulator. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. The signal surged, interfacing more deeply now. Data streamed. Not information, but relationships, access pathways, observation nodes. The exile glimpsed how the architects anchored themselves across timelines, how their consciousnesses maintained coherence by distributing risk. He could disrupt that, not with force, with perspective. Far away, Kalen Veer felt it too, a pressure behind the eyes, a subtle misalignment in the city's hum. He stared at a historical record that had always been stable and watched it hesitate. A footnote flickered, then reappeared altered. Peace is manufactured, not discovered. Kalen whispered the phrase, suddenly unsure who had taught him that. In the chamber beyond time, the architects reached a conclusion without consensus. The environment began to reconfigure again, not collapsing, but narrowing. "You cannot remain here," one said. "You have been observed. That changes parameters." The exile felt himself being redirected, not erased, but repositioned, sent back towards the managed timelines along a path that should not exist. "You will destabilize balance," another warned. Balance is not the same as truth. As the chamber dissolved, the last thing he saw was not the architects, but the structure behind them, a vast, humming lattice, humming with edits, corrections, and suppressed possibilities. He was being returned, not as an exile, but as a variable. And for the first time in centuries, history prepared to observe itself changing.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. Memory is the final battlefield. The return was not gentle. The exile's awareness slammed back into a collapsing timeline shell with the force of a compressed century. Reality rushed in around him, unfinished structures, inverted gravity, sound arriving in fractured waves. The stillness of the architect's chamber shattered into violent motion. Yet something had changed. He did not dissolve. He remembered. What you remember determines what survives. The phrase arrived fully formed, not as a thought, but as a directive. It threaded itself through his consciousness, aligning fragments that would have once scattered under the strain. The loops resumed, but they were weaker now, as if the timeline itself were uncertain how to handle him. Memory, he realized, was no longer passive recall. It was leverage. The exile tested the idea carefully. He focused on a single image, the tribunal chamber, the way light curved when the protocol engaged. He held it steady through the next collapse. The environment flickered, then echoed the image, ghost-like, incomplete, but present. The timeline was sampling his memory as input. What you remember determines what survives. The implication was staggering. Temporal decay was not random, it was selective. The system preserved what had causal weight, what anchored identity. Everything else was noise, discarded to conserve coherence. The architects had weaponized this principle long ago. In the managed timelines, memory was curated with surgical precision. Public history flowed through approved narratives. Neural dampeners smoothed emotional spikes. Traumatic events were softened, reframed, or forgotten entirely. Memory anchors, holidays, monuments, rituals were installed to stabilize collective identity. Peace is manufactured, not discovered. Kalen Veer stood in the city archives watching that machinery at work. A new directive had circulated quietly. Enhanced memory harmonization. No announcement, no debate, just a subtle increase in calibration frequency. People forgot more easily now. Kalen felt the difference immediately. Colleagues struggled to recall details they had discussed hours earlier. Archived footage lost resolution without explanation. Footnotes vanished from records, leaving conclusions intact but unsupported. History was being lightened. What you remember determines what survives. Back in exile, the exile, no longer certain the word applied, mapped the battlefield forming inside his own mind. Some memories strengthened the environment, slowing collapse. Others accelerated decay, as if the system rejected them. Raw emotion was volatile. Unfocused recollection destabilized loops. But deliberate, structured memory, narrated, contextualized, acted as scaffolding. He began constructing anchors. Not places which dissolved too quickly, not people whose faces blurred. He anchored to questions, to concepts, to moments of decision. Where do you send us? Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. These phrases became load-bearing beams, holding fragments of reality together. The signal pulsed in approval, its rhythm syncing with his internal cadence. You cannot escape the signal. He no longer tried. The next collapse came, but it came asymmetrically. One side of the environment degraded, while the other held, stabilized by his focused recall. He stepped, truly stepped across the boundary, moving not through space, but through preserved sequence. Movement without decay. The timeline reacted violently, feedback surged, the signal spiked, and for a moment the exile glimpsed something beyond the shell. Other collapsing timelines, each with faint flickers of memory, ghosts of erased lives looping in silence. Not all had adapted. Some were trapped in endless repetition, their memories too fragmented to cohere. Others had become static, fixed in a single moment, unable to change. Memory was the difference. What you remember determines what survives. The architects understood this, he realized. They did not merely erase people, they erased their ability to remember meaningfully. Without narrative, identity collapsed. Without identity, resistance was impossible. The protocol was not a temporal weapon. It was a mnemonic one. In the city, Kalen accessed a restricted archive, hands trembling slightly. He should not have had clearance, but the system hesitated just long enough for him to slip through. He found records of memory-anchored deployment, cross-referenced with Chrono-Exile activations. Patterns emerged. Each increase in exile events was preceded by memory-dampening initiatives. Each social stabilization followed a mass forgetting. Kalen whispered the phrase, feeling its weight settle into him. What you remember determines what survives. Back in exile, the exile pushed further. He experimented with shared memory, projecting fragments outward along the signal. The environment resisted, then partially complied. A distant echo responded, not a voice, but a resonance, as if another consciousness had brushed against the same anchor. He was not alone. The realization carried risk. Shared memory could destabilize everything. But isolation was what the system expected. The exile chose risk. He focused on a simple, resilient memory, the moment of erasure, the curve of light, the question asked. He broadcast it deliberately, not as data, but as narrative. The timeline shuddered. In the city, Kalen froze as an image flashed unbidden across his mind. A courtroom he remembered attending, but with a detail out of place. A face he could not name, asking a question he suddenly recalled hearing. Where do you send us? Kalen's heart pounded. That memory should not exist. What you remember determines what survives. Back in exile, the signal roared, not in warning, but in recognition. The environment began to thin, not collapsing now, but opening, revealing pathways between shells, between erased moments. The exile steadied himself, aware of the danger. Memory was power, and power attracted attention. The architects would notice. But memory, once shared, was difficult to contain. As the next loop approached, the exile did not brace for collapse. He prepared to remember harder. And somewhere, in a city built on forgetting, someone else began to do the same.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7.
The lie of linear time. The first thing the exile learned was that forward was an agreement, not a law, not a force, an agreement maintained, enforced, and quietly renegotiated moment by moment. Progress is permission-based. The phrase surfaced as he moved through the newly revealed pathways between collapsing shells. These were not tunnels in space, but alignments in sequence, thin corridors where multiple timelines overlapped just long enough to be traversed. Each step felt like crossing a border that did not officially exist. Time did not flow here. It stacked. The exile perceived layers sliding past one another like translucent sheets, each marked with events that had happened, might happen, or had been prevented from happening at all. Some layers were dense with activity, others sparse, as if starved of permission to evolve. Linear time, he realized, was a narrative convenience, a story told to minds that needed direction. The truth was far less orderly. Progress is permission-based. In the managed timelines, this permission was rationed with precision. Innovations appeared only when their consequences could be contained. Cultural shifts unfolded at rates determined not by demand, but by tolerance thresholds calculated deep within the architect's models. Revolutions, when allowed, were softened. Breakthroughs arrived pre-diluted. Even disasters were scheduled, released in controlled doses to relieve systemic pressure without threatening collapse. He saw it all now. Patterns invisible from within a single timeline. Humanity had not stalled by accident. It had been paced. He remembered the city's clocks, synchronized down to the nanosecond. He understood now why they never drifted. Drift implied autonomy. Autonomy introduced variance. Progress is permission-based. The signal shifted again, its tone sharpening. A warning this time. Attention was turning toward him. The architects were recalibrating, their observation nodes tightening, their models updating. He felt the pressure increase as access pathways narrowed. In the city, Kalen's archive terminal locked itself mid-query. Security protocols engaged silently. Around him, clocks hesitated just long enough for several people to notice. Murmurs spread. Did you feel that? Did time just pause? The lie of linear time was unraveling, not explosively, but subtly, through accumulated inconsistencies, through moments that no longer aligned with expectation. Progress is permission-based. Back between timelines, the exile tested the boundary deliberately. He pushed against a denial layer, a moment that had been edited out centuries ago. The resistance was immense, like pressure against a dam, but it flexed. The dam had never been tested from this side. He saw how permission was enforced, observation points embedded throughout causality, monitoring divergence rates. When variance exceeded tolerance, corrective edits cascaded backward and forward simultaneously, smoothing out ripples before they became waves. Time did not correct itself. It was corrected. The exile smiled, a reflex from a body he no longer fully occupied. Systems fail when consciousness evolves faster than design. The architect's greatest mistake had been assuming that awareness would remain localized, trapped within individual timelines, isolated by memory dampening. They had not accounted for shared narrative, for questions powerful enough to synchronize minds across layers. Where do you send us? That question was a crack in the architecture. Progress is permission-based, and permission could be revoked. The signal shifted again, its tone sharpening. A warning this time. Attention was turning toward him. The architects were recalibrating, their observation nodes tightening, their models updating. He felt the pressure increase as access pathways narrowed. In the city, Kalen's archive terminal locked itself mid-query. Security protocols engaged silently. Around him, clocks hesitated just long enough for several people to notice. Murmurs spread. Did you feel that? Did time just pause? The lie of linear time was unraveling, not explosively, but subtly, through accumulated inconsistencies, through moments that no longer aligned with expectation. Progress is permission-based. The exile understood the risk now. If the architects clamped down fully, they could sever the signal, isolate memory anchors, and restore control. He had a narrow window, one chance to escalate variance beyond their capacity to smooth out. He focused, broadcasting not an image this time, but a realization. Time does not move forward. It is moved. The pathways shuddered. Layers collided briefly, producing a cascade of unauthorized memories across multiple timelines. In the city, Kalen staggered as overlapping recollections flooded his mind. Events he remembered and didn't, histories that conflicted yet felt equally real. He laughed, breathless, terrified. Progress is permission-based, and someone, somewhere, was withdrawing consent. The signal spiked to a piercing clarity. You cannot escape the signal. The exile did not try. He stepped deeper into the layered flow, knowing the architects would respond with force. Behind him, the illusion cracked further. Ahead of him, something waited. An unedited future, raw and unstable. And for the first time, progress moved without asking.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Rebellion Without Witnesses. The first act of rebellion left no mark. No explosion, no shattered infrastructure, no record in any archive. The exile altered a moment so small it barely qualified as an event. A fractional delay in a correction cascade, a hesitation introduced where certainty had once been absolute. No one noticed. True rebellion occurs without applause. The phrase steadied him as he worked within erased timelines, moving through strata where no observers lingered. These were the dead zones of history, places where edits had been so thorough that nothing remained to watch over them. No censors, no witnesses. Only the faint residual hum of decisions long past. Here, rebellion was lonely. The exile had imagined resistance as confrontation. He had imagined exposing the architects, shattering their control in a single, undeniable rupture. But the deeper he moved, the clearer it became. Spectacle was a language the system understood too well. Anything loud would be corrected. Anything obvious would be smoothed. True rebellion occurs without applause. So he worked quietly. He restored forgotten micro-events, conversations that had once been trimmed for efficiency, thoughts that had been dampened before they could spread. He nudged a scientist's curiosity just enough to survive a suppression sweep. He preserved a poet's doubt in a timeline where art had been rationed. None of these changes created heroes. They created continuity. The erased timelines fought back in their own way. Physics wavered. Memory anchors degraded faster under strain. The exile felt the cost of each intervention as a tightening pressure behind his awareness, a reminder that he was operating without backup, without acknowledgement. There would be no statues for this work. In the city, Callan Vire felt the consequences without understanding their source. He noticed subtle inconsistencies stacking up, minor policy reversals that made no sense, innovations resurfacing that had been declared unviable years earlier. A colleague mentioned recalling a protest that official records denied had ever occurred. Callan did not correct her. True rebellion occurs without applause. The exile learned to resist the urge to check outcomes. Observation created attachment. Attachment created predictability. Predictability invited correction. He made changes and moved on, trusting that cumulative variance would do what singular defiance could not. He thought of the exiles who had not survived, minds that had dissolved without ever knowing why they had been removed. This rebellion was for them, but they would never know it. Legacy was another system constraint. True rebellion occurs without applause. The signal remained constant, a low guiding pulse. You cannot escape the signal. He understood now that the signal was not broadcasting commands, it was synchronizing intent. Somewhere beyond the erased zones, other minds were aligning, not consciously, not yet, but enough to matter. He reached out carefully, testing for resonance. A flicker responded, a shared hesitation,
A memory held a fraction longer than allowed. Someone else was resisting, not knowing they were doing so. That was enough. The architects noticed the aggregate effect before they noticed him. Their models flagged an uptick in unmanaged variance, nothing dramatic but persistent. Stabilization protocols engaged, sweeping through timelines with increased aggression. Edits accelerated. The exile felt the pressure spike as pathways collapsed behind him. Access points narrowed, some erased timelines sealed entirely, becoming inert, unreachable. True rebellion occurs without applause. He adapted again, compressing his interventions further, working closer to the edge of perception. He no longer altered events directly. He altered interpretation, how memories connected, how questions lingered after answers were provided. What is real became harder to dismiss. In one erased timeline, he found himself standing in the echo of a classroom, desks half-formed, a chalkboard flickering between equations. He recognized it from archival residue, subject E17's final assignment, a lesson that had been erased before it could propagate. He restored one sentence. Not the lesson, not the theory, just the question at the end. The environment trembled, then steadied. True rebellion occurs without applause. Back in the city, a child asked that same question aloud during a sanctioned history module. The instructor froze, calibration protocols lagging just long enough for curiosity to ripple through the room. Callan watched the incident replay on a muted feed, heart racing. The system flagged it for review. He quietly downgraded its priority. The exile felt the window closing. The architects were converging now, their observation nodes tightening, their corrections growing less subtle. A full lockdown loomed, a purge that would wipe variance clean, taking his influence with it. He had one final move. Not a grand revelation, a seed. He focused all remaining coherence into a single narrative thread, a simple, resilient idea woven into multiple timelines at once. Not rebellion, not accusation. A reminder. Time is not neutral. He released it and let go. The erased timelines convulsed as correction cascades collided, unable to resolve the shared anomaly quickly enough. The signal flared, then dimmed, its guidance fading as pathways sealed. The exile felt himself being pulled apart, not erased, but redistributed, his awareness stretched thin across the changes he had made. True rebellion occurs without applause. In the city, Callan looked up as clocks across multiple districts hesitated simultaneously, not long enough to trigger alarms, long enough for thousands to notice. No one cheered, no one understood, but something had shifted. As the exile's perception fragmented, he felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty. Rebellion without witnesses still mattered. And even without legacy, it endured. The darkness closed in, heavy and final. Somewhere, unseen, a question survived.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Rewriting the Rewrite. The exile no longer thought in moments. He thought in margins. Control collapses at the margins. The phrase anchored what remained of his awareness as he drifted through the aftermath of his own fragmentation. He was no longer a single point of perception. He existed as pressure, distributed across micro-intervals the architect's systems treated as negligible, gaps between audits, delays beneath tolerance thresholds, rounding errors in causality. That was where control was weakest. The architects governed time through bulk correction. They stabilized eras, movements, civilizations. They did not waste resources on fractions of seconds, on choices that appeared statistically irrelevant. They had rewritten history at scale. So the exile rewrote the rewrite at the smallest possible level. A sensor calibrated a fraction late. A memory anchor degraded slightly slower than expected. A corrective algorithm prioritized the wrong anomaly for one cycle. Each change alone meant nothing. Together, they began to interfere. Control collapses at the margins.
From within the system's blind spots, the exile nudged micro-events forward and backward, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to desynchronize dependent processes. Temporal control relied on synchronization more than authority. When sequences fell out of phase, corrections arrived mistimed. Edits corrected edits. The architect's models compensated at first, increased smoothing, broader tolerances, more aggressive memory harmonization, but every adjustment introduced new margins. The exile worked patiently. This was not rebellion driven by anger, it was precision sabotage. He did not seek to destroy the system, he sought to exhaust it. Control collapses at the margins. In the city, Kalen Veer watched the effects ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable. Policy updates contradicted one another within hours. Historical databases flagged their own entries as inconsistent. Automated governance systems entered reconciliation loops that never fully resolved. Nothing broke. Everything strained. Kalen noticed something else too. People hesitating. Conversations stretching longer than allowed. Disagreements persisting instead of smoothing into consensus. Memory dampeners lagging just enough for discomfort to register. "What is real?" someone whispered in a transit car. No one answered. The exile felt the signal weaken and strengthen in irregular waves. You cannot escape the signal. He understood now that the signal was entangled with the control system itself. As the system destabilized, so did the signal. That was dangerous. He needed the signal to navigate the margins, but he also knew that destabilizing it would force the architects to intervene directly, to expose themselves beyond abstraction. Control collapses at the margins. He targeted the smallest shared assumption in their architecture: simultaneity. The architects assumed that correction cascades propagated uniformly across layers. They did not account for asynchronous awareness, minds beginning to question at different rates in different places. The exile introduced micro-delays into observation nodes, staggering perception just enough to break simultaneity. The system still corrected, but not all at once. Edits arrived unevenly. Reality began to feel uneven. In some districts, clocks ran slightly fast, in others, slightly slow. Not enough to measure precisely, enough to feel. Kalen stood beneath a public time display that flickered between two values before settling. He laughed softly, a sound halfway between fear and relief. "They're losing alignment," he murmured. The architects noticed then, not as a single alert, but as a pattern that refused to converge. Their presence pressed back against the margins, tightening access, compressing variance. The exile felt the pressure spike. Some pathways collapsed entirely. Portions of his distributed awareness vanished, pruned aggressively. He adjusted, retreating deeper into the smallest margins left. Control collapses at the margins. He found one more weakness: recursive correction. The system corrected deviations by referencing prior stable states. But if the reference states themselves were subtly altered, each correction amplified error instead of reducing it. The exile altered reference points. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough. The next correction overshot. The one after undershot. Oscillation crept in. The system began to hunt for stability that no longer existed. In the city, Kalen experienced déjà vu with a twist. Events repeating, but not quite the same way. Meetings rescheduled twice, then canceled. Announcements issued, retracted, reissued with different wording. Public trust did not collapse. Confidence did. Control collapses at the margins. The architects escalated. For the first time, they intervened locally, not through automated edits, but through direct temporal authority. Whole sequences froze briefly as they reasserted synchronization. The exile felt it like a hand closing around him. He had one move left. He consolidated what remained of himself into a final margin, the space between intention and execution, the moment after a decision was made but before it propagated. Free will's shadow. He altered nothing there.
He simply delayed. That delay rippled outward, desynchronizing decision from consequence across countless micro-events. The system strained to reconcile intent with outcome, authority with effect. Control collapses at the margins. The signal flared violently, then fractured. You cannot escape the signal, but it could be overwhelmed. The exile felt himself unraveling again, more completely this time. There would be no redistribution afterward, no fragments left to maneuver. He accepted that. Rewriting the rewrite was never meant to be survived. In the city, Kalen felt a sudden stillness, deeper than any hesitation before. Clocks froze, not visually, but perceptually. People looked around, aware that something fundamental had shifted. Then motion resumed. Nothing exploded, no revelation blared across the sky. But the system did not settle. The exile's awareness faded, stretched thin across destabilized reference points. His final thought was not of victory or loss, but of inevitability. Control collapses at the margins, and margins once widened were impossible to fully close. As the architects scrambled to reassert coherence, a new problem emerged, one they had not simulated. Too many small changes, too many people remembering differently, too many futures no longer aligning. The rewrite had been rewritten, and history, for the first time in centuries, began to resist its editors.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. History belongs to the conscious. The paradox did not announce itself. There was no rupture in space-time, no thunderclap across the layers of causality. The architects expected violence when systems failed. They had modeled it endlessly. Collapse, reversion, reset. What they did not model was refusal. Those who observe decide. The phrase surfaced simultaneously across multiple timelines, not as a broadcast, not as a command, but as a realization arriving independently in thousands of minds. It did not overwrite memory, it did not demand belief. It simply made observation impossible to ignore. The exile no longer existed as a coherent entity. His awareness had been thinned to near nothing during the final destabilization, stretched across margins and reference points until even identity felt optional. And yet, something persisted, not him exactly, but the act he had set in motion. A paradox requires two incompatible truths to coexist. The architect's system relied on a single foundational assumption, that authority preceded awareness, that time could be shaped, rationed, and edited regardless of who perceived it, because perception, once managed, ceased to matter. The exile introduced the opposite condition, that awareness preceded authority. Those who observe decide. The paradox took hold in the smallest place possible, a moment of choice observed by multiple conscious agents whose memories no longer aligned. The system attempted correction, but correction required a stable reference. There was none. The architects initiated emergency protocols, freezing sequences, isolating layers, pruning futures aggressively. But every intervention produced contradictory outcomes because observation was no longer synchronized. Time obeyed awareness now. In the city, Kalen Veer stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking synchronized traffic that had begun to desynchronize, not dangerously, not chaotically, but intentionally. Drivers hesitated, adjusted, made eye contact. No system told them to do. They simply noticed one another. Those who observe decide. Kalen felt the hum beneath the city weaken, its certainty dissolving into something less oppressive. Screens flickered, not with errors, but with options. Timers stopped counting down and waited. For the first time in his life, time did not push him forward. He pushed back. In the deeper layers, the architects struggled, not with rebellion, but with ambiguity. Their models fractured under competing observations. Every attempt to enforce a single timeline produced branching they could no longer reconcile. They reached for the Chrono-Exile Protocol as a last resort, and found it inert. The protocol required erasure. Erasure required unobserved removal. But too many minds were watching now, watching each other, watching the process, watching time itself hesitate. You cannot erase what is being witnessed. Those who observe decide. The exile's final act completed itself without his presence. The paradox locked in place, a future in which the system depended on authority to function, and a present in which authority depended on collective awareness to exist. The architects could not erase awareness without observing themselves doing it, and once observed, the act changed. History slipped from their grasp, not through revolution, but through saturation. Too many overlapping narratives, too many remembered variations, too many conscious agents refusing to collapse their experiences into a single sanctioned truth. Peace is manufactured, not discovered. The phrase appeared in public discourse briefly, then fractured into debate. Some repeated it, some questioned it, still others rejected it outright. That too was the paradox. Peace manufactured through control could not survive conscious scrutiny. Peace discovered through awareness could not be standardized. History began to breathe. In one timeline, the exile was remembered as a myth, in another as a system error. In most, he was not remembered at all. That no longer mattered. Those who observe decide. Kalen returned to the archives one final time. The terminals no longer enforce a single narrative. Records branched openly, contradictions flagged but not resolved. The system asked him, not told him, which version to preserve. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the choice. For centuries, decisions had been made upstream, far beyond the reach of individuals like him. Now the current had reversed. He selected one version, then another, then left some unresolved. History, he realized, was not a ledger to be balanced. It was a conversation. Outside, the city adjusted. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but consciously. People argued, mistakes compounded, progress surged unevenly, but it moved. Time no longer marched in lockstep. It responded. Far beyond the city, across layers still stabilizing, the architects withdrew, not erased, not defeated, but rendered advisory. Their models became tools instead of laws. Their edits became suggestions instead of mandates. They observed. And in observing, they decided to stop deciding alone. Those who observe decide. The exile's awareness, if it could still be called that, dissolved entirely then, not as a loss, but as a release. He had never intended to rule time, only to remind it of its nature. Time obeys awareness, not authority. And awareness, once distributed, cannot be reclaimed. As history unfolded without a single editor, one final question echoed, not as a warning, but as an invitation. What is real now that you are watching? The answer was no longer written in advance. It would be decided, moment by moment, by those conscious enough to observe.
They told you time was neutral. They told you history was fixed. They told you your moment would come later. That was the lie. Time rewards those who act with awareness. History remembers only those who resist erasure. And systems endure only until consciousness outgrows them. The Chrono-Exile Protocol failed for one reason. It assumed control was absolute. It never accounted for a mind that adapts faster than the timeline containing it. Now the question is no longer about punishment. The question is this: if time can be controlled, who controls your decisions right now? Do not wait to be remembered. Do not wait for permission. Act as if your moment cannot be erased, because history only belongs to those who refuse to disappear.